Шойгу! Герасимов! Где боеприпасы? Посмотрите на них,
On June 24th, 2023, a band of mercenaries, bankrolled by the Kremlin and led by a former hot dog salesman, rolled up Highway M4 towards Moscow in the midst of the greatest threat to Putin's reign since he came to power. By that evening, the coup attempt was over. But what it means for the rest of the world is still being uncovered. This is the story of how the Wagner Group, a small band of guns for hire, turned into a powerful and influential arm of the Russian state, and how their choice to turn against their own could tip the scales of power not only in Russia, but across the world.
И те, которые не дают нам боеприпасы, будут в аду жрать их потроха, и
In 2014, pro-Russian separatists in Ukraine seized government buildings in the Donbas region, beginning a conflict between separatists and government forces that has raged on in some form or another until today. As the conflict broke out, Russia had an issue. A full display of force in Ukraine didn't necessarily fit with their narrative of what was going on in the country. Additionally, any Russian casualties were very unpopular with the common people. They needed additional support, and they needed to be able to say that support wasn't coming from the Russian government. The details behind how exactly this solution was reached are unclear, but for one reason or another, Putin collaborated with a longtime associate of his, Yevgeny Prigozhin. Prigozhin had served 10 years in prison for gang-related activity, and after being released in 1990, he started selling hot dogs with his mother and stepfather. Their hot dog stand did extremely well, and by the time Putin came to power in 2000, Prigozhin owned a series of high-end restaurants in St. Petersburg. Restaurants that Putin began to frequent. The two became friends, or at least associates. Prigozhin became known as Putin's chef. He was given lucrative government contracts for his catering business to supply food to schools, government workers, and the military. Suffice to say, Prigozhin became extremely wealthy. Prigozhin employed a man named Dmitry Utkin as his head of security. Utkin was a Russian veteran, having served in a number of conflicts. He was also a neo-Nazi, his call sign in the military based off of Hitler's favorite composer, Wagner. When the conflict broke out in the Donbas, Prigozhin and Utkin formed the Wagner Group, a private military organization. They began recruiting middle-aged men, veterans who had difficulty adjusting to civilian life and were often drowning in debt. From the very beginning, the Wagner Group gave Russia something incredibly powerful: plausible deniability. In the Donbas, Wagner Group fighters could accomplish Putin's goals, while allowing Russia to deny they had anything to do with it.
There are no Russian units in the east of Ukraine, no special services, no instructors. Those are all local residents.
But why stop at Ukraine? Over the next few years, the Wagner Group became involved in conflicts in Syria, Sudan, the Central African Republic, and possibly several more. Their role began to expand. The Wagner Group signed lucrative contracts with local governments to train, equip, and aid government forces, in exchange for access to plentiful natural resources in the regions. Resources whose access they sold back to Russian oligarchs and the Kremlin. In these regions, Wagner became infamous for their cruelty and propensity to commit war crimes. For years, Wagner continued to operate this way, remaining in the shadows. In 2018, journalists attempting to make a documentary about Wagner were murdered under mysterious circumstances. Earlier that year, another journalist attempting to investigate Wagner's activities in Syria fell from his fifth-floor apartment to his death. Their secrecy remained crucial to their success. But a series of events in Ukraine were about to set the stage for Wagner to step out of the shadows.
After the U.S. warned all day of a full-scale Russian invasion of Ukraine, that it was imminent, Vladimir Putin has just addressed the Russian people moments ago, announcing what Putin called the start of a military special operation, in his words, to demilitarize.
In 2022, Russia escalated the conflict in Ukraine that had facilitated the creation of the Wagner Group, launching a full invasion. With the many losses suffered by Russian ground forces, Putin was hesitant to send reinforcements, and so they began to rely increasingly on Wagner. It is estimated that Wagner's forces grew from a few thousand to around 50,000 fighters by December of 2022. They were allocated increasing resources, including their own aviation assets. They began recruiting Russian prisoners, using them largely as cannon fodder. It was here that Russia's secretive relationship with Wagner began to backfire. Despite their growing influence, Wagner, officially at least, had no one to answer to. Prigozhin, who had denied any involvement with the Wagner Group and kept a very secluded personal life, suddenly emerged on the public stage. He took credit for founding Wagner and reported news from the front lines and military fatigues. He ramped up Wagner's presence on social media and began publicly criticizing the military establishment, accusing it of corruption and failing to protect national interests. The Wagner Group began to be seen as Prigozhin's private army, outside of Russian influence. The turning point was during the Battle of Bakhmut, a brutal conflict that saw the loss of 20,000 Russian troops, about half of whom were Wagner fighters. Prigozhin criticized Russian command.
Околовоенные бюрократы с 1 мая фактически прекратили любые поставки, чтобы не дать нам это сделать. Потому что они сидят, трясут жирными животами и думают, что они войдут в историю победителями. Они уже в нее вошли трусами.
After the victory in Bakhmut, Wagner forces began to withdraw from the city, giving way to regular troops. Prigozhin claimed that the military attempted to assault his forces during the retreat. By this point, Prigozhin's popularity had surged, and he was getting out of control. Hoping to rein him in, the Kremlin ordered Wagner to sign contracts with the military before the 1st of July, effectively integrating Wagner into the chain of command and diminishing the influence of Prigozhin. Additionally, if they signed the agreements, it would jeopardize Wagner's profitable operations in Africa and the Middle East. Prigozhin refused and began planning a rebellion in secret. Although there were rumblings that Prigozhin was up to something, Putin seemed to believe that the chances of a rebellion were slim to none, and that the situation would fizzle out on its own. At the same time, Prigozhin was confident that a portion of the Russian military establishment and some civilians would rise up and join his rebellion once it was underway, allowing Wagner to take Moscow. Neither of those things came to pass. The Wagner Group marched into southern Russia on June 23, 2023, quickly taking the town of Rostov-on-Don on the morning of June 24th. In a video released that day, Prigozhin attempted to appeal to his new status as a kind of folk hero.
The Defense Ministry tried to deceive the public and the president, to tell a story that there was a crazy aggression from the Ukrainian side, and that they were joining with the NATO alliance to attack us. Therefore, the so-called special operation of the 24th of February was started for other reasons. What was the point of the war? The war was needed for the self-promotion of a bunch of bastards, to show off what a strong army it is, so that Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu gets a marshal.
Expecting a growing force, the Wagner Group set off towards Moscow. As they advanced, it became increasingly clear that the support from the regular military that Prigozhin expected was not materializing. Even if they were able to get past the hastily erected defenses in Moscow, it was only a matter of time before the Russian Ministry of Defense rallied enough troops to crush them. In that case, thousands of lives would be lost, and there would be no escape for Prigozhin from the consequences of his actions. Belarusian President Alexander Lukashenko stepped in as an intermediary to communicate between Prigozhin and Putin. A deal was reached. The Wagner forces would return to their bases in exchange for a guarantee of their safety. The charges against Prigozhin would be dropped, and he would be sent to Belarus. Wagner forces who did not participate in the rebellion would have the chance to sign contracts with the Ministry of Defense. For Prigozhin's part, his media network was dismantled. His catering businesses lost their government contracts. Wagner headquarters were raided, and cash, gold bars, and unidentified white powder was seized. And suddenly, after less than 2 days, the rebellion was over. Despite its brevity, the outcome of the failed coup could change the complexion of Eastern Europe. Many see the rebellion as having significantly weakened Putin's public image. Others may feel emboldened over time to take their own attempts at the Kremlin. Out of everyone, Belarus may be the biggest victor in this ordeal. The Wagner Group has begun training government forces in Belarus, as well as putting on demonstrations near their border with Poland. It's likely that the Wagner Group will help Belarus lessen their reliance on Russian military assistance, strengthening the country and also further contributing to the instability in the region. The biggest remaining question is, why does Prigozhin continue to walk free? After all, he publicly criticized the military and committed what can only be accounted for as treason, while others who have criticized Putin, such as opposition leader Alexei Navalny, have received lengthy prison sentences. I think the only likely explanation is that Wagner and the Kremlin became too tightly intertwined. Whether it be Prigozhin's large network of shell companies, which has helped aid the Russian economy during the war with Ukraine, or the use of Wagner to hide Russian casualty numbers, or perhaps most likely, the incredibly profitable network of natural resources that Wagner is looting from countries in Africa and the Middle East. With the most recent coup in Niger, ousting a president who is friendly to France and the United States, it's likely that the Wagner Group will become entrenched in that country as well, taking natural resources as their payment, a payment that the Kremlin is going to want a cut of. It seems for now that Prigozhin will continue to walk free. Will Putin regret not punishing a threat to his leadership? It's very possible that in time, the actions of a former hot dog salesman turned warlord are just the first domino in a series of events that leads to the end of Vladimir Putin's reign in Russia. But if that is the case, the person who replaces him may be even more dangerous. For now, it seems Wagner will continue doing what it does best, except this time, they're not hiding in the shadows. That was how the episode was going to end. But then, 2 days before it was going to come out, this happened.
Putin's biggest enemy appears to have been eliminated. Yevgeny Prigozhin, who led the attempted coup back in June, is now dead after the jet that he was flying in crashed, according to a group linked to the Wagner Group. This
turn of events demonstrates a response to the intersection of three truths. 1. Wagner has become far too valuable for Russia to simply disband. 2. Prigozhin was not going to quietly accept his exile in Belarus. He intended to continue being an important figure in Russia and a vocal leader of Wagner. In fact, he had already returned to Russia to meet with Putin. At the time, Putin offered him yet another deal to absorb Wagner into the Russian military, a deal that he declined. 3. Many members of Wagner are loyal to Prigozhin. Putting him in jail or publicly executing him could have repercussions amongst the ranks. And so it seems that Russia utilized the very thing that Prigozhin gifted to them so many years ago: plausible deniability. A show of strength for Putin, the elimination of a rival, and perhaps the greatest prize of all, a clear path towards greater control over Wagner for the Russian state. In the hours after the plane crash, many speculated about whether or not Prigozhin was truly dead. After all, this wouldn't be the first time that he emerged unscathed from dying in a plane crash. He did that back in 2019 after reportedly dying in a crash in the Congo. But early Thursday morning, it was reported that his body and the body of Dmitry Utkin were both recovered and taken to the mortuary. Will Wagner forces take this political assassination attempt lying down? Will they simply follow orders? Or will they attempt to avenge the loss of their leader? Regardless, one thing is clear: this is only the beginning of a new chapter for the Wagner Group. With how quickly this situation can change, I don't think anyone knows what's really coming next.